Good evening.
Good evening.
It's good to see everybody tonight. Good to, I just love watching the kids go to class. Just, well, they're so cute for one, and you know, they just learn such great things back there. And to learn them at that age, it'll just be with them forever, you know. And so it's just such a pleasure to see the kids here as well. We'd like to open to Exodus 17. We're going to be in Exodus 17 this evening. And Moses is going to bring us some water out of a rock tonight. And then he's going to hold his arms up for a really long time and get tired. And so we're going to be in Exodus chapter 17. And the primary question that this chapter is going to ask us is the Lord among us or not? Is he here? Does he care? Does he help us? Is he really able to handle the situations that we face? Or is he not? And of course, we just had the Red Sea crossing a few chapters ago, and their kind of great celebration afterwards, and all of the singing and the joy and the confidence that God was able to provide for them. But that was very quickly followed with lack of water, bitter waters, and just difficulties that put a lot of damper on their joy and faith. And then we come to Exodus 16 that we looked at last week, where they were given the manna, and the Sabbath was really established, and all that goes with that. And we saw that again, God was very capable of giving them what they needed, that they were hungry, and so they got not just the manna, but the quail, and that he was able to provide for them each and every day. Picks up in chapter 17, Exodus chapter 17, and it says that all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. And so he gives us first their location. They're in Rephidim. They're getting close to Mount Sinai. That's where they're headed toward. But they have no water. It's sort of a waterless environment. And then in verse 2, he says, "Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, 'Give us water that we may drink.'" And first of all, it sounds here like they're already complaining, and maybe to a degree they are. But the word that's used there, contended, is not one of the words that's used throughout the Exodus and Numbers to describe complaining. It's really a word that's most frequently used when someone has a justified complaint, or I don't know if it's justified, you call it a complaint, a justified need, something that they need. They have no water, and really they're just asking for water. At least on the surface, that's what it looks like. But notice what Moses says in verse 2. He says, "So Moses said to them, 'Why do you contend with me? Why are you asking me for water? And what am I going to do? Do I look like God?' And then he follows that with, 'Why do you tempt the Lord?'" Tempt, you think tempt, you could say test. Why do you test the Lord? And that actually probably feels very familiar. Probably we could think of, can we think of other places in the Bible where people talk about testing the Lord?
Seems like in James it said something about, maybe I'm way off. I thought it
No,
said
you're
something
right.
like the Lord can't be tempted.
Okay, yes. So yeah, James talks about how he himself can't be tempted, and he says in that same place that God doesn't, tempt us. He doesn't
Test us.
Yeah, put us into those situations where we are going to sin. Yeah, we're talking about God can't be tempted or tested as far as he's not going to give in to temptation. So yes, and in particular, you can think of what Jesus said when he was being tempted by Satan. That there was the temptation that Satan put before him, and to kind of leap off of the top of the temple, right? He says the angels will catch you if you jump, and you are the Son of God. The angels will not let you be harmed; they will catch you. And Jesus tells Satan that first of all, he's taking scripture out of context, which Satan is good at, and second of all, that even if that were true, even if he thought the angels would catch him, if it's not necessary to jump off and be caught by angels, then we shouldn't push it, right? Don't do something just because you can, right? That to jump off without reason, just to see if God would catch you, is to test you. And he says, "You shall not test the Lord." And when he says that, that's in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 7. Matthew 4:7, Jesus says, "You shall not tempt or test the Lord." When he says that, he is quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Notice Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 16. Yes, sir. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 16. And in Deuteronomy chapter 6, as Moses is teaching them about their homes especially, he says in verse 16, Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 16, he says, "You shall not tempt the Lord your God as you tempted him in Massah." And Massah just means tempted. And Massah is the place that they're at in Exodus 17. When you go back to Exodus 17, you can see that's the name that they give that place after God provides them water. And so Moses is referring specifically back to this moment that we are studying in Exodus 17, and he says, "Why do you tempt the Lord?" And then later in Deuteronomy, he's going to say, "Do you remember when you did that, when you tempted the Lord?" And he's going to tell them not to do that. And this is what Jesus is quoting, not to tempt the Lord. And so you kind of get the sense that when they are asking for water in Exodus 17, "Give us water that we may drink," they're not doing this out of a sincere sense of concern that they're going to have water, that they think they're going to die of thirst or something. But it's kind of like they just want to see God do something cool. Or they don't want to do the work to go find the water. Or they just want to kind of push God into this corner where he's got to provide all of the water for them. It's very much similar to what Jesus says in John chapter 6. And do you remember in John chapter 6, after Jesus had just fed them all of the loaves of bread and all of the fish, he'd multiplied it miraculously. And then the people come to him, they find him, and they're kind of asking for another meal. And in John chapter 6 and verse 26, Jesus says, You're not here for me. You're just here to get your belly full. You're just here to see me turn more bread into loaves and loaves and loaves of bread. You don't want to go work and get bread. You just want to follow me around, so I'll feed you all the time." And so they become people who are not following God because it was right. They're not following God because he was good. They're not following God because they loved him. They become people who are following God for what they could get out of him, for the benefits, for the free food. That's, if you say free food, people will show up, right? That's what they were doing to Jesus. He had done it once, so they thought, well, maybe he'll just feed us every day from now on. And so that in verse 3, it says, the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained. Now this is a word, we talked about this word last week, the idea that they settled down in their complaint camp, that they set up camp in their complaints. Maybe they really were thirsty, but they're dwelling on it, and they're complaining about it. He complained against Moses and said, "Why is it you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" In other words, we don't believe that you're going to do anything about this. We don't believe that God is capable or willing to take care of us this time. Now, he'd done it every other time leading up to this point. But again, we're just going to die out here, and nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to take care of us. And so let's look at John chapter 6 for just a minute. It really is. It's sort of manipulative, isn't it? It's I like a guilt trip of sorts. Instead of just saying, "Hey, where's the water? How can we help you get this?" It's, "You're going to let us die out here." And so in John chapter 6, notice John chapter 6, and starting in verse 25, John chapter 6 and verse 25, it says, "When they found him on the other side of the sea," and this is just after he fed the 5,000 miraculously with bread. "They found him on the other side of the sea. They said to him, 'Rabbi, when did you come here?' And in verse 26, Jesus answered them and said, 'Most assuredly I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled.'" And he goes on in verse 27 to tell them not to seek the food that perishes, but the food that leads to eternal life. And then if you jump down to verse 30, if you get down to verse 30, he says, "Therefore they said to him, 'What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you?'" Now Jesus had performed multiple miracles up to this point, including feeding 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread. And it's very similar, isn't it? What all had God done in Egypt leading up to this point? I mean, multiple miracles over and over again. He provided for them, and so he says, "Just believe in him who in the Father sent." In verse 30, well, we need another sign. What new sign will you do? What else can you do for us to prove that you're saved who you are? And then in verse 31, they quote Exodus 16, just the chapter we studied last week. Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And so, verse 32, Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And it's this very poignant thought. Now, he's going to develop it from here. Remember, he's going to tell them to eat his flesh and drink his blood, and they're all kind of grossed out by that, and a bunch of people leave. But if you read closely, what he's really saying is, where does satisfaction come from? What really, truly satisfies? Is it the bread that God gives us, or is it God himself? That's why he says, I'm the true bread that the Father is sending. It's that relationship with Jesus, it's that relationship with God that brings true satisfaction. The gifts are just evidence that he's trustworthy, but it was never supposed to be about the gifts. And the people in John 6, Jesus says, had made about the gifts. And so Exodus 17, because they quote from Exodus 16, and then Jesus quotes from this section when he's talking about how we shall not, or that we shall not test the Lord. All kind of seems to be pointing to the same idea that maybe they weren't even really all that concerned about water. What they wanted was to just get as much as they could from God. Just suck him dry if they can, use up everything that he has. And so they complain. In verse 4, it continues and says, Exodus 17 and verse 4, Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, what shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said to Moses, go on before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod which you struck the river, and go. And so they're here at Rephidim, and their desire is water, but really what it indicates is their desire is just to get what they can out of God. And so they kind of present this challenge. Will God spoon feed us again? Will he just do everything that we want him to? And verse 4 and 5 give us a reminder that they need it. Now, Miss Linda, do you have your hand up? Yes. Yeah, I think that's, you do see that a lot today, both in the church and out of the church, of as long as, really it's very parallel, I think. Do you remember back in chapter 14 and verse 8, as they are leaving Egypt, it says that the children of Israel went out with boldness. It's like when things are going how they think it should, everybody's happy. But as soon as they hit any little hardship, well, what have you haven't done anything for me, and how long has it been? Two days? Since this morning when you gave us the manna, what have you done for me lately? I think that's a good point. Was there a hand over here too? Yeah, okay. All right. And so yeah, in verses 4 and 5 then, he gives us sort of this reminder that they needed. He gives us sort of this visual, here it's a visual thing. He says, take in your hand your rod, and then he says specifically, which you struck the river. Now, what event is he talking about specifically when he says the rod with which you struck the river? Not the Red Sea exactly, although it is related to that, yes, but yeah, I'm sorry, David.
No, I said the Red Sea.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to hear you say it wrong. No. You're not wrong exactly, but he's specifically talking about the first plague. And do you remember when he struck the river and it turned to blood? But I'm sorry. Yes, the Nile River. Yes, and it turned to blood. But that's really, he's indicating all of that, because if he goes back to the first plague when he used that rod, he's thinking, okay, well then there was the next time he used the rod, and the next time he used the rod, all the way to the Red Sea when he put his hand out and parted the Red Sea. And so it's kind of an all-encompassing thing. He pulls out this rod and reminds us that this is what Moses has been using as a demonstration of God's power. This is sort of a visual reminder of what God is capable of. And he says, take that with you. And as we go through this chapter, I think we'll see that has a really big impact on the people. But they have this sort of rod they have this rod that he's going to use. In verse 6, he says, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, and the people may drink. And so Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the name of the place Massa, which is what he calls it in Deuteronomy, or Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us, or is he not? And so you have this rod as the reminder, you have the solution. God is the one who can satisfy their thirst. It's interesting, isn't it? In verse 6, he tells Moses to go to the rock, but he says, I will stand before you. That in some way, maybe it was the pillar of cloud, he was there. And the people knew where the water really came from. And then also he says, in verse 5, he says, take some of the elders. And at the end, he says he did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And I think there's sort of an implication there. What's implied by twice now telling us that there's going to be a limited audience, that not everyone is going to see this, just a few of the elders are going to see this. What's kind of implied as far as what they should have done with this information afterwards? That there's kind of a teaching thing going on here. That not everyone's going to watch this happen. Just some of the elders, not even all the elders, just some of the elders are going to see this. That there's this responsibility of what God has done for me, I'm going to take back and tell others, especially those who I'm responsible for. So, my children or whoever, that we're sharing what we've seen God do with one another to build each other's faith. You think they're camping in their complaints, but imagine if instead of camping in their complaints, they had been camping in their praise for what God could do. And talking about, oh, remember when he did this, and remember the last time we were thirsty, he provided, and remember, and this idea of what are we focused on? Are we focused on what we don't have? Are we focused on the God who can give us anything, and who always knows what we need, and always provides what we need? And so, and you do get this sense that there is this kind of parallel here because of what the New Testament says. You notice 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verses 3 through 4. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and in verse 3, Paul is talking about, in verse 1, he calls them the people who passed through the sea, and he's talking about the Red Sea, and so he's talking about this group of people, and he says in verse 3 that they all ate the same spiritual food, and that's kind of a reference to Exodus 16 and the manna. And then he says they drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ, 1 Corinthians 10:4. And so Moses strikes this rock, and water flows out of it. Now, rocks don't produce water. That's just not what they're designed to do, I don't care how often you kick a rock on the ground, water's just not going to come out of it. This is something miraculous. But notice Paul says they ate of spiritual food. In Exodus 16, the manna is a physical food. But there's something else going on. If they ate that manna with thankfulness and appreciation, if they ate that manna with awe of who God is and what he can do, then they were built up spiritually as well. And that's true here. As they drank that water, if all they did was get their tongues wet, they really missed the point of it. They might have lived another day after that, but they missed, here is a God who can bring water out of rocks. And so having that connection to that God, that's what's satisfying. He says the rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But in striking that rock, where does the water come from? It comes from Jesus. It comes from God. He is the one who brought that water. It's very much in line with what Jesus says in John 4:14. Do you remember what he told the woman at the well about water? And she's really obsessed with physical water. And he says, if you drink this water, you'll be back tomorrow. You're going to have to come to this well every day. But if you're focused on the water that I can give you, then you'll never be thirsty again, and it will spring up into everlasting life. And she's still thinking about physical water, and she's like, I'd love to skip coming to the well every day. That's like a whole, half hour of my life I could do something better with. And that's what we tend to do, isn't it? We take God's spiritual blessings and we make them physical. And we take God's gifts, physical or spiritual, and we make them about how much I can collect, how much I can have, how much more that there can be for me. And we forget that the gifts are really just about pointing us to someone who is great and who cares for us and who can satisfy us. And so when you're in Exodus chapter 17, and you think, the Lord is among us. Is the Lord among us or not? He is among us. He satisfies us. And you think about these people who really, they just want God to make it easy on them. They just want to see how much they can get out of God. What are some ways that Christians today sometimes test God in this way of really just seeing how much can I get out of God.
I think of like people sometimes preach, is it called prosperity
Yes.
gospel? You think he'll take care of us, but his idea, the way he takes care of us sometimes isn't the way that our expectations
We
are.
think, yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And prosperity gospel is most often preached, like by televangelists or something like that. And if you send them enough money, then send me $10 and God will give you $1,000 or whatever, and it really is. It's about for the televangelists especially how much you can get out of God. And so but I think that's a good example of a way that people do that. And that really you see even in the church people do that sometimes. It's all going. Oh, yes, go ahead. Sure. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And you see that. Yeah. The not that there's a restriction on what you can pray to God about, but just that sometimes our focus is on we are unhappy or unsatisfied because our focus is on things that we don't actually need. We just really wish we had. And so maybe even we're praying for them, but you watch people's faith fail as they don't get things that they want. Even though they have what they need, you could be satisfied, and I think that's true. David.
Well, I see it on the internet lots of times. They'll say, if you'll say an amen, you're going to get something great in 3 days or something.
Oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
Or they say honk if you love Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
I refuse to honk with the same for Jesus with the same horn that I used to blow some idiot off the road.
That's like James 3, right? Both with the same tongue. It's praising God and cursing Him. Yes. All right. Yes, I like it.
Zach understands.
No, that is. I really hadn't thought of that, but that's. I have seen those on Facebook, and it's sort of like a formula. It's like if you do this, God is required to give you that, and it's not a relationship; it's a transaction. Yeah.
I was going to kind of mention the converse of it because I think that we teach that concept when we repeat things that teach children to think as they're growing up that if things are going bad, they must not be doing good.
Sure. Yeah.
What's the old saying? Well, you must be living right.
Yes.
Because they're getting
because
blessed
they
physically.
Have wealth or good looks or whatever it is.
They
Yeah.
must be doing something wrong.
Yeah.
And then it causes people to get their minds wrapped around backwards. Not just that, but
right.
Their own hearts. What is Proverbs 19:3? Man's foolishness ruins his life.
I think
and he blames God.
Yes, and then he blames God. No, I think that's a good point. And it's really an age-old argument that the world has made. That's what the book of Job is about. You can get to a point, and not that blessings are bad. Certainly, they're blessings, right? They're good. But where you begin to sort of test your Christianity or your salvation based on what you have, and if something goes wrong, well, you think, well, God must be mad at me, or I must have done something wrong, and you begin to try to acquire more or have more or whatever it is, just as proof to yourself that you're in a good relationship with God, and you kind of miss the boat there. And yeah, Steve.
Well, Psalms 44, we was reading it last night. And, it's telling that God, they're trying to pray for deliverance, and God deliver them. They talk about we haven't really done anything, but we're being mistreated, something terrible. And I thought, sometimes that happened. Job fell in that boat.
Yeah.
Where all this is happening to me, and I thought the Lord, you and me tight.
Right.
And that's the way it goes and everything, And you're talking about people doing things. I watch every once in a while in the morning. There's a guy called Joseph Prince. Have you seen him?
No.
He's from Shanghai.
Okay.
And he's got a huge audience. He makes 500,000. He preaches. He makes 500,000 to 600,000 a year. But he keeps that money.
Right.
All this money he gets, he keeps. But he really does a good job because he really preaches on the Holy Spirit all the time. But But and he does. If you listen to him, you think, man, he really can get this right. But he's got big audiences that have a lot of wealthy people, and really he's really just getting filthy rich.
Yeah.
Off of the Word of God, and of course the Bible talks about that.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yes. Miss Tammy. Yes.
I have heard several people in the church, not here, but I remember going to Dykowski. There were a lot of Dykowskis that went to North Street. And many of them had the thought that you were going to be blessed monetarily if you were being the right type of Christian and everything. And Johnny and I were going to school at the time, and even now, you know, I think we've done a good job of trying to be the best Christians we can be.
Sure.
But he's not blessed us monetarily.
Right.
And they teach or say that if you do this, you will be blessed monetarily.
Right.
And
Yeah. And
that's so wrong.
yes, ma'am. Of course, monetary blessings are relative, of course, but that's first Timothy 5, and 6. He talks about it's if you are wealthy, that's a blessing, and you can use that for good. That's also a temptation. And if you're poor, that's a blessing in its own way, and it brings its own temptations. And that's why somewhere in Proverbs, toward the end, he says, "Don't give me riches, because I'll curse God and trust myself, and don't give me poverty because I'll steal and give myself. Just give me just enough, But wherever you fall in that, I do think that the point carries as far as rich people can be guilty of covetousness because they just want more, and it becomes about trusting what you have. And poor people can be guilty of covetousness because they look at what they don't have, and it doesn't matter where you fall. It can become about the gifts, and it can become about getting what you can out of God. And maybe these people are showing up, right? They didn't stay in Egypt. They haven't left Moses' side yet. They're what we would call relatively faithful, but they're really just there for the gifts. And so even today, we can show up and we can be here on Sundays and Wednesdays, and we can be at the events and what people would call faithful, but we're really just in it for the gifts. We've missed the point entirely. Sarah? Proverbs 30 and 7, if you want to look at that. Proverbs 30 and verse 7. Thank you, Sarah. And so, I think at the end of the day, what you're looking at is, if you contrast and compare how Moses handles these things and how the people handles these things, the people always complain and sort of, well, what are you going to do about this? We're just going to die out here. What is God going to do about this? And then you notice, what does Moses do? Moses always turns to God and says, what do we do about this? How can we solve this? What's the solution? Sarah?
It's like the people were putting God in a box and saying, you need to give me this. But Moses was saying, let's put him outside the box and let him do what he does in his good time.
In his good time, yeah. It's the God is a vending machine versus God is not in our control, but it always turns out better than we thought it would anyway, kind of thing. Yeah. So, if you go back to John 6, oh, yes, ma'am.
I just want to ask him, when it talks about tempting the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
is that like trying his patience or tempting him to
Yeah,
do
it's
something?
to tempt or to test the Lord is to sort of ask him to do something or see if he will do something even though you don't really need that done. Or so that's why when Satan had Jesus at the top of the temple and he said, if you throw yourself off, the angels will catch you. Jesus said, that may be true, but I don't have a reason to do that, and so I'm not going to ask God to do something just to prove that he will, and that's.
Well, I was just thinking of it, like, you might say to your kids, don't push me.
Don't push me,
Do
yeah,
something
yeah.
you don't want
I
me
think
to do.
that's pretty in line with the idea, of they just want to see how far they can go, how much can they get away with, That's very much this idea, but instead of away with, it's how much can I get? Yeah, I think so.
One of the things you pray for, not just want this and get this, be thankful
thankfulness. Yeah, I think, and I do think you see that lacking here with them. Yes, ma'am.
I think you hear people do that today, like, they'll say like, well, if God lets me win the lottery, then I'll go to church every Sunday.
Okay, yeah, a bargaining
It's that
thing.
same,
Yeah.
like, if you save me from this situation, then I'll know that you're real and I'll follow you.
Yeah.
And God's given us the proof He wants to give us, and it's fully adequate. And so asking Him to meet our criteria in order to believe in Him is us being over Him.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the problem, and that's the second time Moses is at the rock, different rock, but same situation, and he strikes it twice, and he does it wrong. That's kind of what he says to them is, you rebels, that you have put yourself over God. And she referred to, if you let me win the lottery, then I'll follow you, or I'll do this or that, and sort of trying to manipulate God into giving you what you want by telling him that you'll do what he wants, or you give me what I want, you scratch my back and I'll scratch your back, kind of relationship with God. And so, yeah. That typically, that's I can't think of what it is. I watched a movie one time where that someone said, "Oh God, if you'll just give me whatever it was," I think it was they were in the hospital and they were dying. If you'll just save my life, I will be a good person or whatever. And then 2 minutes later, the doctor walked in and they said, "Great news! Like, you're in remission." And he said, "Never mind, God. I figured it out. I got it covered." And yeah, and it's like, well, so I kind of missed the point. But yeah, if you go back to John 6, you've got two kinds of disciples there. You have the disciples who are saying, "Please do more signs and give us more bread. Please fill our stomachs. That's really what we're here for." And at the end of the chapter 6, they leave, and Jesus says, or John writes that Jesus knew from the beginning that they weren't going to stick with him. And then you have the disciples who, at the beginning of the chapter, see all of the hungry people before he performs the miracle of multiplying the loaves, and they say, "What do we do about this? Should we go to town and buy some more bread?" No, I mean, we see that those disciples, they had their own struggles, and they were still growing and learning. They were not, perfectly mature and understanding everything spot on, but they're just trying to solve the problem. They're just trying to be a part of the solution. And that's, I think, what you see the real difference is in these attitudes is people who kind of camp in their complaints and who are really just in it for what they can get, just complain about what they don't have. But the people who are in it because they are with God, because they love God, they want to walk with him, see a problem, and it may be a legitimate problem. They may be really dying of thirst or whatever it is, but they say, "I know God can solve this. What's my part? How do I help him solve this? What do I do in God's plan to make this happen?" Any other thoughts or comments on the first half of chapter 17? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think a lot of times today, a parallel to what we're talking about is when congregations are trying to bring people in, especially kids, and we're going to build a gym, and we're going to build this, and those are, you have to bring people in for the gospel.
Right.
You can't, because as soon as the honeymoon's over, and I don't want to play basketball anymore.
Yes.
That's my motivation.
I think that's true. I mean, I won't say that nobody who ever came for pizza didn't end up studying the gospel someday, but that generally what you see is when they come for pizza, they leave and the pizza's gone, or the gym, or whatever it is. And that, maybe to a degree, we're trying to play God a little bit as far as, well, let's get people in our building. Certainly we should be out there, asking people to come and teaching the gospel and whatnot. But at the end of the day, doesn't 1 Corinthians say that God provides the increase? And sometimes I feel the harder I try to get people here, the less people come. And then when I'm just kind of like, I don't know what to do, suddenly they're just coming out of the woodworks, and stuff. Yeah, Miss Tammy.
We need to be thinking and talking to others about the blessings that God has given.
Sure, yeah.
There's so many blessings. I mean, I can say many blessings that Johnny and I have had.
Yes, ma'am.
The years.
And that, I think that's a very biblical model you see the apostles do in the book of Acts when they talk to new people, is start with what God has done for them before they jump to the changes that need to be made. Convince them that God really does care about them. And of course, not everybody responds to that because not everybody wants it. But, that's I think that's a very biblical model to look at there. So, all right, as we pick up then in verses 8 through 16, you have a new story, but it is, there's some really similar kind of ideas here. And so it says that Amalek, which was there kind of in the wilderness, they wandered, that country was there, came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose us some men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. And so Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up on top of the hill. And so right away what we notice is this is their first conflict since they left Egypt. They've had lots of conflict with Egypt, but since they've crossed the Red Sea and God has crushed the army in the sea, they've not really met other people so far. So this is the first time that they've come across other nations and the first battle that they have had to fight. And so, naturally, that's disturbing. We can kind of understand that. And notice, I feel like Moses is kind of picking up on what works here, because he says at the end, he says, I will go to the top of the hill, right? That's where everyone can see him. Really, both armies can see him is what's striking to me. And what is he going to take with him? That same rod, the rod that struck the river, the rod that is the reminder of what people, or what God can do. And he takes Aaron and Hur with him. And this is the story where when he holds his hand up, the Israelites are winning, but if he lets his hand drop, the Amalekites start winning. And when you think about that, it's what weakness is there that would cause the Israelites to stop winning when he lowers his rod? Is the weakness with God? No. And so what is the significance of him holding the rod up that has them to win? Where does the weakness lie? That if he drops it, they lose. In the people, they can't see it, right? People, Thomas doesn't believe unless he can touch and feel and see, and Jesus says, blessed are those who believe and do not see. That's us, because we've never seen him, right? But that's, Paul says we walk by faith, not by sight, but isn't there a comfort in being able to see something, and that when he lowers that down, the people don't believe as much as they did when he holds it up. The people have sort of made this rod almost into a magic charm. In a way, they're almost worshiping the rod more than they are God. But God is working with them to kind of get there. And so, of course, he has to have Aaron and Hur to hold up his arms all night. They bring him a nice stone to sit on, so comfortable and soft and cushy, so he can sit down because he's tired. And then they hold his arms up for him until the battle is won. And Joshua does defeat, verse 13, the Amalekites. And Moses can finally let his arms down because they're probably numb at this point. And so verse 14, the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Now, first question, why is it so significant for him to recount it to Joshua? Joshua led the battle. He was there. He knows what happened. Why specifically recount it to Joshua? I think that's part of it, yes. Joshua, the book of Joshua, is going to be the leader in Moses' place someday. And so there's this kind of emphasis on preparing him for that. And I think you notice, write this for a memorial. You will remember this later. You should. Recount it. Right? Tell it again to Joshua, and that he's going to utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek. Now that's kind of funny, isn't it? Because it sounds contradictory at first glance. I will utterly blot out the remembrance of, put anybody's name in there and you automatically will remember them, won't you? Because their name is now written in the place where you said you're going to blot them out utterly. And so I don't think he's trying to say no one will remember the Amalekites. They were still a people after this. He just defeated one part of their army. They still had a country. They were still a people. You can find references then in history. God doesn't mean he's going to make us forget that they ever existed. It's a comparison. What are they not going to focus on? What are they not going to recount? What are they not going to memorialize? The enemy, the problem, the difficulty. And do you know people like that? When they look back on their life, all they can see is difficulties and problems and heartaches, and they can't remember anything good that happened to them. And when they talk about their life, all they can focus on is difficulties and heartaches and struggles, and they can't see anything positive happening for them. And you look at them and you think, well, you have this, and you have that, and you have that, but they don't see those things. They just remember the problem. He says, I will utterly blot it out. we are not focusing and remembering and recounting and memorializing the problem, but the hero. And I think that's some of why Joshua is there. He kind of represents that. And Moses built an altar and called its name, "The Lord is my banner." Banner, you're thinking a big flag. They used to call them standards. And anyone familiar with kind of what the significance of a standard was during battle?
It was used for signaling
Yes.
and to help the troops figure out, okay, where's the commander?
Yes.
The order's coming to him.
Yes, that's if the commander has to tell everyone in the army where to go one by one, it's not going to be very effective. But if you can tell one person that everyone can see, it's a lot more smooth and efficient. And so the banner itself signifies who protects the army. You know, when the Egyptians went to battle, every part of the army was had a banner for a different Egyptian god. And so this part is protected by Ra, and this part is protected by Horeb, and blah blah blah, and so forth and so on. And so it represents who protects that army, who leads that army. In the same way that, you know, if the American troop runs into battle with an American flag, they are you know, representing the government, the people, the nation of America, and who they stand for. And so you know, there's that's really, yeah. Well, the staff is really the standard there.
So wasn't that harking back to when these people were needing water? What did he do?
He hit it, yeah.
Did he throw it on? Did he lay it on the ground and walk up to the rock, or did he raise it up?
He raised it up, yeah. And that's over and over again.
All these visualizations they were having is when he hearkened the Lord into their lives. That staff.
With that staff, and it was raised up high. Yes. And I think that's really what he's getting at. But notice what he says. Does he say, "The staff is my banner"? It's the Lord is my banner. Yahweh, the covenant God, the one who has made promises and a relationship with us. He is really the power and the strength. And you know what I think makes that most significant is you think Moses and these two men are on top of a hill. And so, as we said, all the Israelites can see him, but so can all the Amalekites. And don't you think the Amalekites had some guys standing in some trees or something, kind of watching everything to see how it's going? And they think, you know, every time that guy lowers his staff down, they all kind of lose their confidence and they start to falter. And so what do? Wouldn't you send someone to the top of the hill to get rid of Moses so that you can, you know, that's what you would do. Who really was defending Moses from the Amalekites? Only God. Aaron and Hur are just holding his arms up. They're not able to do anything else. Why was Moses safe on top of the hill with a battle underneath him? Why didn't someone use a bow and arrow to shoot him down? God was his banner. God protected him. God directed them. And in verse 16, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now this goes back to something that God told Abraham when he said that any enemy of God's faithful people will you know, their city gates will be broken down. It's the idea that as long as Amalek chooses to oppose the faithful of God, God will continue to oppose them. That from this day forward, just as it was with Abraham, if there was anyone who was opposed to God, they could trust God to give them victory if they just would do it. And so it's a promise that God is faithful. And that's what he's trying to convince them of, that they don't seem to get in their head, is God doesn't fail. And so he will succeed over them if they keep on trusting him. He will protect them no matter what. And so you have chapter 16, God satisfies their hunger. Chapter 17, the first 7 verses, God satisfies their thirst. And then chapter 17, the last part, God satisfies their need to feel protected, to feel safe. And isn't that, you know, what Jesus said? The Gentiles all seek after food and water and clothing, you know, kind of representative of that security, but not to worry about those things because God knows you need them. If you seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, he'll provide them for you. So that's why I think the New Testament references this section so often. God provides the basic necessities of life, not because that's all we need, but because they are a reminder to us every time you pick up a piece of bread, every time you buy a hamburger from, you know, where do you like to go? Burger King or Arby's or Dairy Queen or wherever you like to go, from Juicy's, right? Every time that you pick out a piece of clothing from your closet, it should be a reminder. God gave this to me. And if God can give me this, and he is so faithful, I lost y'all with the burger thing, didn't I? Y'all are just still stuck there, aren't you? That was a mistake, wasn't it? God, I'm just out of the loop, I guess. God gave me these things. And so, I mean, every time that we have any of our basic needs met, we should stop and remember this comes from God. And if he can provide all of this, then what can God cannot do? I can trust him for the bigger things of life, for the spiritual things of life, for everything that I need. Any last thoughts or comments here? Okay, we will wrap up there, and next week we'll be in Exodus chapter 18.